Wayfair presents Accent Furniture. Ooh la la. Save on cabinets in every style.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to the Turn Back the Time series sponsored by the First Bank. Uh, we have cold weather and rainy weather and hot weather, and it's back turning cold, and it may snow, and we'll have a flood by morning. So the, the rain will stay the same. But a special thanks to First Alabama for sponsoring this series of enjoyment. I'm delighted that we've got this good crowd here. I have been waiting for Dr. Bunn to come back after his discovery of the 14th colony, and we've realized that it's what historians do. It's not what really happens that come to the forefront. And Mike, thank you for making Alabama the 14th colony, although it was not officially done, and I would be afraid to even try it now. But Big Jim Folsom did try part of it one time, and he failed. So if Big Jim would fail, the rest of you don't need to have to go out and start anything. But please turn off your cell phones and get ready to listen to the best historians. Mike, this thing on Fort Stoddert, which was built in 1799. And another reason is when Jackson was here with his people bivouac down at the Coosa River just south of here, that the veterans in that conflict over at Horseshoe Bend were the same ones that went on down south at the Fort Stoddert and the Battle of New Orleans. So we have some interest here, and you people need to act like the British are coming, and you need to get them in straight. Today we'll hear about Fort Stoddert, which was built in 1799 right on the Mobile River. He's going to tell us why this is such an important diplomatic and military concentration of all the good and bad that happened in one place. In other words, the key to the West was in this particular area. He's going to do a wonderful job on that. He does have books to sell, and if you want an outstanding history book on the subjects he's talking on today, or many of the other books that he's written, keep in mind he's a native Alabamian. He's a top-notch scholar. He was respected by other people, and he demands the very best from himself. So, Mike, we're just thrilled to have you here. And if you want to add something about the historic Blakely State Park, of which you are in charge, please do so and invite us down. But please see if you can get some coupons to give us before we come. Mike, Dr. Mike Bunn.
Thank you for that. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. And yes, you're all invited to Blakely's. Have I ever been to Blakely? I think I've asked groups like this out of my area before. Has anybody ever been to historic Blakely State Park? It's huge. It's over 2,000 acres. We're one of the largest national register sites east of the Mississippi. 30-second soundbite on where I work is that we're Alabama's largest Civil War battlefield. We take cruises into the Mobile-Tensas Delta 12 months out of the year. We've got 36 different cruises. We've got camping, cabins, a wedding venue, a regular schedule of events. So if you're in our area, if you're down in the Mobile Bay area, check us out sometime. It's fun to work there. There's a lot going on. What I'm going to get to talk to you about today is my most recent book on Fort Stoddert. This is really a very critical installation in early U.S. history and in this region's territorial and early statehood period. The book will talk about the fort. Everything about the fort's importance, though, is in context with what's going on in the region. Just an enormous amount of events of consequence occurred within or affected or were directed from this frontier fortification, which had jurisdiction over an enormous area, and yes, it involves this area. So while this was part of the Mississippi Territory, a lot of the things that were associated with even North Alabama were happening and associated with Fort Stoddert. So I'm going to show you where it's at on the map and tell you all about it as we go throughout the presentation. The first thing to mention, though, is that I do have a co-author, Susie Hartman. Now, Susie did not write a word in the book except for the introduction. So how is she the co-author? She did all the research. Susie grew up in Mount Vernon, where Fort Stoddert's located. Had a lifelong passion in it. She's still around. She's in her late 70s, very active still in researching, but she's had a passion for collecting anything she could about Fort Stoddert for decades. And after hearing me at one of my presentations, or the second or third that she had seen me at, she pulled me aside and said, I know you've got an interest in the time period. Would you be interested to see my collection of stuff? So I said, yeah, out of courtesy. I went over and I saw what she had, and everything was arranged in boxes by year. I mean, she had stuff from the National Archives. She's got stuff from Mississippi, Alabama, on and on. I said, basically, Susie, you've laid out all the research for a book. And she said, that's why I brought you here. I wanted to see if you're interested in writing it. And I had no intention of writing on it, but the hard work was done. And what I love to do is assemble the things and write it. I like that better than the research, to be honest. And she's just the opposite. She loved the research, had a hard time writing it. So we made for a great combination. And so that's what the backstory of the book is. Okay, so there is a historic marker for Fort Stoddert. I'll show you a map in a second, but first of all, make sure we orientate everybody to where we're talking about. This is Mobile County. So we're far south end of the state. It's a little community called Mount Vernon, and Fort Stoddert is right there on the river. If you've gone down to Mobile and you've ever been down Highway 43, this is where you would see that. And there's a little railroad junction, and the community is not thriving like it was back a few decades ago, but there is a historic marker there, and that's right off of 43, and you've got to go another 2 or 3 miles to get to the river where there's a landing. That's where the fort was. So it's a place that people have heard about a lot, but a lot of people, even in the Mobile area, don't know exactly where it is. They've heard the name. So we'll walk you through that a little bit during the presentation. Another disclaimer I have on this is that if you're expecting to see a lot of great images of Fort Stoddert, I'm sorry, I don't have them. There are no known drawings that I've ever seen contemporary. There are no photographs. It was gone before photography. What we do have, and we use as much as we can, are 2 maps that actually depict a fortification, and I think that that's a reasonable depiction of what the general outline of the fortification. But that's about as close as we come to a physical drawing to represent what this place looked like. Now, there's some other things I'll explain that probably help us understand a little bit about how it was made, but we just don't have a good drawing of the thing. It was only in existence for 15 years in this frontier period, and in process of researching the book, Susie had done 90% of the work, but there were certain things that once I got into the records, I tried to find more about or confirm what we knew or didn't. And I discovered that during the time period that records from this specific area, where they were supposed to be in the records of the National Archives, that there was a well-documented fire and a loss of records of certain categories, and this is where a lot of Fort Stoddert's stuff would have been. So maybe there might be some stuff that would have been there, or maybe it will be discovered, but I found that is one of the several reasons we don't have all the details we should on Fort Stoddert. So this is the best I've got. And I'll try to elaborate on it and help you understand it to the best of my knowledge. So let me start about how Fort Stoddert got to be where it was and why it was such a pivotal spot. So to understand that, we've got to go all the way back to colonial history, and I've spoken to this group about my book about 14th Colony, where this was a British colony of West Florida in South Alabama. And at that time, you think we got to, yeah. So this was British territory, and then this was Spanish, this was French. Mobile's founded by the French. So if you go all the way back to the 1740s, 1750s, that was the situation. And then once the 7 Years' War occurs, France leaves the entire area as a colonial power. They're totally gone, and all you've got are Great Britain and Spain. So Great Britain annexed this entire area, and they set up 2 colonies, West Florida and East Florida. And this was their first border of West Florida. This is 1763. That's the 31st parallel. That's the first time that line shows up on maps of the Southeast. Still with us today. You recognize that line as a boundary with the panhandle of Florida and over here in Mississippi and Louisiana. So that's where that comes from. But the very next year, they annexed to the north. They drew the border a little bit further north, and that's the colony in its fullest extent. So we're going to come back to why that was such an important move. But that was the colony as the British observed it. So that is the boundaries of the colony of West Florida. So after the American Revolution, Spain conquered that colony. Spain took over West Florida during the American Revolution. We had fighting in Alabama in the Revolutionary War. It was just mostly between the Spanish and the British. So Spain conquers it. So what does that mean? That means that the United States southern border is now the border with West Florida. Now, where's the border of West Florida? 31st parallel was the first border, but the British moved it up. So this was a subject of great debate between the United States and the Spanish. The Spanish said no, that was their original border, but we conquered the colony, we're going to observe that later border. So this rocked on for about 15 years. Eventually, Spain agrees to withdraw to that original border the British had at the 31st parallel. So when they did that in 1798, this area immediately was annexed by the United States and organized into a territory. That's where we begin the story of Alabama as a part of the United States with the Mississippi Territory. Now, it doesn't look like it does today. All this was added, and this was eventually added. But that's where our story begins. 1798, the United States forms the Mississippi Territory out of that disputed boundary, and the first thing they've got to do is, first of all, they're going to establish where the border truly is. They commissioned Andrew Ellicott to run a survey along the 31st parallel. So he's going to survey that original border of British West Florida. He's going to go from the Mississippi to the Chattahoochee. And along the way, he is going to leave in a few places some monuments and at least one stone monument that still stands there. Has anybody even heard of or been to Ellicott Stone, Highway 43 near Mobile? If you're coming south and you're going down 43, do yourself a favor and stop there. This thing was placed in 1799 by Ellicott. And on one side of it, it says U.S. property, latitude 31, 1799. On the other side, I don't think I've got an image. On the other side, it says property of the King of Spain. It was truly an international boundary on the 31st parallel. So this boundary is marked, and the first thing the United States wants to do is put a fortification as close as they could to that new international boundary. Obvious strategic spot for a lot of reasons. So the geography of where we're talking about, of course, Mobile County. This is the little community of Mount Vernon. This is the Mobile River that forms that boundary there. So if you pull up on Google Maps, you're going to see Mount Vernon on 43, and the actual fort site is over here at a boat landing, near a boat landing on the Mobile River. The other thing to point out here is that 31st parallel comes right through, right about here. So you're just north of the parallel, as close as they can get, but it's on a strategic spot on the Mobile River. You see that's one single stretch of the river. Just to the north is where the Tombigbee and the Alabama come together. So you've got two streams. They merge into one. They run as one for just a few miles, and then the Tensas branches off of the Mobile. And this goes on down to Mobile. This goes down to the eastern shore. And so it's at their strategic spot where the rivers is one channel. So remember, rivers of the day were the superhighways of the day. So you're occupying a very strategic spot at a border on a narrow strip of water where anybody going up and down the entire river system has to pass right under there. So that's one of the main reasons Fort Stoddert was placed where it was. And it's meant to be a center for administration of justice, and we'll get into that. But who is it named for? It's named for Benjamin Stoddert, who was a Secretary of War, late 1790s, early 1800s, during a little conflict that's called the Quasi-War, where the United States was really engaged in an undeclared war against France. He was a famous man of the time. It wasn't like he was some founding father. Everybody knew the name. They still don't know the name today. But he was very well known as a leader of American forces and revamping the Navy literally at the time Fort Stoddert was founded. So if you had picked up a newspaper following this process of this war in 1799, his name would have been there. And I don't know how or why, but they decided he was a good enough guy to name the fort after. So they named it Fort Stoddert. And I also wanted to point out the spelling of his name. I don't know what I'm doing there. Let me go back. Well, it's not going back. There it is. Okay, it's just a little bit late. So the spelling of his name, when you pick up maps of Alabama, you will see Stoddert spelled every kind of way. It will be Stoddert with an ART. It will be Stoddard ending in ARD. It will have one D or two Ds, on and on. this is the official spelling of the guy's name and the fort. So that's just to clarify that, because you will see it spelled several different ways. See if this advances. There we go. So let's get to the actual founding and establishment of the fort. So this is 1799. The United States says we're going to issue this, we're going to establish this fortification. It's going to be a center for administration and American jurisdiction of this new territory. And so they send a group all the way out of Natchez to do this. Remember the geography. Just to the south is Mobile, but that belongs to the Spanish. So supplies aren't coming that way. They're coming from the nearest American post, which is Natchez, Mississippi. And they're coming overland. And they're coming about 300 miles. And they're bringing guys to hack down trees and erect a fortification in the wilderness in the summer of 1799. Not the ideal time to do it. And that's why some of the letters that we have from the first commander, Bartholomew Schomburg, are some of the most descriptive of what the fort actually looked like. And he is basically describing a week by week, here's where we are, here's what we're done, here's what we need to do. And he says at one point, I come along but slowly with fortifying. He says, it's hot as blazes, there's mosquitoes, guys are sick, there's only so many hours in a day we can work. So it takes them longer to build the fortification than it might have in other conditions. But even with all that said, it still took them just a few months to put this thing together. And if you look at his descriptions, this is not Fort Stoddert. This is something that was similar. His descriptions indicate that it was constructed with wood. It had wooden bastions, and it had along one of the walls. He even specifically says, you know, we constructed one of the bastions or two of the bastions, and he says one of the first things they built was a barracks for the men, and that doubled as the back wall to the river. So you start understanding in your mind's eye a little bit about the way this place was built and oriented from his written descriptions. We don't have any drawings. This is another period fortification very similar to what Fort Stoddert may have looked like. But anyway, his description of that progress helps us understand the way the thing actually looked. Real quick, Schomburg is the first commander. Captain, it's Thomas, not Tom Swain, that's a typo there. Schuyler, Edmund Pendleton Gaines, Richard Sparks. This is the entire list of commanders that were there over those 15 years. Every one of them faced difficulties. None of them are exceptionally well known today. The one that you may recognize the name of is General Edmund Pendleton Gaines. If you've ever studied Alabama history, he's got a city named after him. He's got a few places, Gainesville, even Gainesville, Florida is named after him. He was around in a lot of events in this time period. If you've ever read early Alabama history or old Southwest history, in the Mississippi Territory, et cetera, he served all the way until his late 70s, active in military. So he got to participate in everything from the early 1800s to the War of 1812 to the Mexican War. The guy was just around for everything. And I've given some presentations on his remarkable life because he's buried in Mobile. And I always joke, this guy is the Forrest Gump of the old Southwest. Everything that happens in early Alabama, he seems to be present for because he was just so long-lived. But anyway, he's the one of these commanders that people sometimes will recognize the name. But that's the entire list of them. And that's Mr. Gaines as a very young man right before he took command of the post at Fort Stoddert. So what was life like for these guys who were there? Well, you got a certain amount of official records that tell you what their daily routine was, and it's not all that dramatic. You know, they're having to follow military discipline. They've got fatigue duty. They've got various things they've got to do. Some of the more enlightening aspects of what really illustrates what's going on there come from things that really weren't designed to track day-to-day life. They're accounts, they're artifacts that have been discovered. There's an account of an illness that I'll share with you and help you understand what life was really like there, because if you look at the just daily muster roll things, it's not particularly, doesn't really give you a lot of the rich detail of what life was really like there. These are artifacts that have actually been found at the fort site. The fort site has not been archaeologically confirmed as far as its entire fort dimensions. There's no survey yet. We don't know the true dimensions, but we know generally where the fort stood and where outbuildings were. And there's a concentration of artifacts that have been gathered over the years. Some have been, like this was donated to and photographed by University of South Alabama's Archaeological Museum. And all this stuff dates, it's the right stuff, the right time period of what soldiers were using. And from the types of things that have been found, you can help understand a little bit of the type of things they ate, what they were issued, what they wore, etc. We just don't have very many rich descriptions. We're having to look for other things to do that. But in general, imagine yourselves as a soldier, you're on a frontier garrison, and your supply line is coming from Natchez, Mississippi, over the woods, through 300 miles, and it's hot, and you've got yellow fever and yellow flies and everything else, and no air conditioning, and you're in a swampy area. All that doesn't sound like the most pleasant environment. Well, people stayed sick. A lot of them stayed sick there, and Fort Stoddert became known as a place as a pretty unhealthy garrison. And one other thing about Fort Stoddert is that we sometimes forget that places like Fort Stoddert were on the frontier, the periphery, the border with the international boundary, but that doesn't always mean that they were out there in the woods alone. This area where Fort Stoddert was established was actually one of the more populous areas in the entire Mississippi Territory. It was a place where people were coming for settlement. There were no large towns like Mobile, but there was a cluster of settlement. And one of the things you'll notice in even maps that aren't really designed to depict this, but that's Stoddert along the river, and all these little dots, those are little farmsteads, homes. So the fort stood within something of a community. And as it grew, the communities grew. So it's an interesting little connection, because the fort, from its earliest days, it was meant to be a center of official federal regulation, administration of a region. It quickly morphed into becoming something of a local center of justice, unofficially. This is another map of the Mobile-Tensaw Delta from right before Fort Stoddert was founded. What I draw your attention to is all these rectangles, which are land concessions, land grants, where people were either coming to settle, or they're hiring people to clear them out, or some are actually sending enslaved laborers under supervision to clear this out. You've got a combination of things, but the point is this was becoming an agricultural district, just like it was in other places that were more developed. And Fort Stoddart sort of in the middle of that. So although there's no big towns around it at the time, it was still in the center of a pretty significant population center for the region. And at the time, remember, this is the Mississippi Territory. Eventually, with all this is eventually added later. But this is the entire extent of the Mississippi Territory before division into the states of Mississippi and Alabama. So Fort Stoddart is way down here. At the time, just for reference, there are the only towns, the only American towns, I should say, more than 1,000 people. Because the Native Americans had some towns bigger than that. They actually, there's it's a little sidebar. A lot of people think of the frontier period in Alabama as the Americans are coming, settling these cities, and the Indians are out somewhere in the woods. And the Indians viewed it just the opposite, because the Creek Indians had large cities of 1,000, 2,000 people, and the Americans were the ones living out in the woods. So it's a different way to think about it. But the major American communities at the time would have been Natchez, Mississippi, about 5,000 people, by far more than double the biggest community anywhere else in this entire area. The other major community, Huntsville, is starting to come online. It's founded in 1808, has a few hundred people. Early Tuscaloosa is beginning to establish itself, what's eventually going to become Montgomery. All these are small communities, but none of them have the population that this area did. No big city, but Fort Stoddart sat in a district that had over 5,000 people, scattered across what we recognize today are 3 counties, Clark County, Washington County, and Baldwin County. So all that is to say, this is a significant population center in the territorial period. So one of the ways to best illustrate how Fort Stoddart quickly became a center of local justice was that, it was these settlers are moving there, and this is before they even established courthouses and all the workings of a county government. And Fort Stoddart's there, and you've got American officials, and so a lot of people look to it to settle local court cases, et cetera. And one of the more humorous examples of how Fort Stoddert became sort of a local civilian institution is it's passed down through, this story has been repeated a lot of times, but on Christmas Eve, in I think it was 1804, Daniel Johnson and Elizabeth Linder, who are across the Delta over on near Fort Mims, where Fort Mims would eventually be built, they decided that they wanted to run off and get married. Well, where's their local courthouse to go to? You got to drive hundreds of miles or walk hundreds of miles, or you could go down to Fort Stoddert. They just guessed there'd be somebody there to Fort Stoddert to marry him. And so they appealed to the commander once they arrived there and said, would you please marry us? And he said, well, I'm not a civil official. I don't have any authority to marry you guys. But as the story goes, after a few rounds of eggnog, it was Christmas Eve, he decided he did have the capacity. So he married them. And he said famously, go home, behave yourselves, multiply and replenish the Tensile country, and send them on. But years later, I did find in some of Susie's research that maybe they had some questions about his authority to marry him, because 2 or 3 years later, they got remarried in the county courthouse once one was established. So anyway, just a little, it shows what the services that the fort was offering. So this is one of the very few returns of troops that survives in archives from Fort Stoddert. It just basically, I know you can't read all that, it basically just says who was present, who was sick, and if you looked at it real close, you'll notice about half of those present, about 75, were sick. And that happened a lot. They called everything, once you hit about April or May, all the way until late fall, that was called the sickly season, so half of the year. This was when guys were succumbing to all kinds of fevers, et cetera. So life was not good there. And it was poorly supplied. Schomburg writes at one point, he said, I have so few supplies and it takes so long to get anything. He said, if one of my guys stumbles around and breaks a leg, I don't have the proper equipment, I don't have the right surgeons, I don't have anything. We're just gonna have to take an axe and chop off his leg to keep the guy from dying. He said, that's how difficult our situation is. And you don't have a lot of firsthand accounts of the individual soldiers, but things like this help you understand a little bit of what conditions were like for them. Not the best. Ephraim Kirby, he was a territorial judge. He was sent to the area. And of course, the only place to put him is Fort Stoddert. That's not where they meant to keep him for very long, but that was the only institution they could put him in. He comes to Fort Stoddert, ends up passing away at Fort Stoddert. And the account of his illness is it illustrates a lot that was going on to me. I'll share that with you just a second. But Kirby, I think I've used this in other presentations, but he's got one of the best descriptions of the people he encountered in Southwest Alabama you'll ever read. President Thomas Jefferson asked him to describe the community and the people that he's encountered. He does this long report, and his summary of the people in Southwest Alabama is this. This section of the United States has long been afforded an asylum to those who prefer voluntary exile to the punishments ordained by law. So half the people are running away from justice somewhere else. That's what he's saying. He said the present inhabitants are wild, illiterate, and savage, depraved morals, unworthy of public confidence or private esteem, litigious, disunited, and knowing each other, universally distrustful of each other. So he's saying that this is a Wild West frontier, and in some ways, it really was. Now, Kirby, while he's there, he succumbs to one of these fevers that's claiming the lives of the enlisted soldiers. And for most of those guys, they just show up on a list that they were here, present, sick, deceased. Well, Kirby, you've got some collection of letters written by the post commander or by him and relayed to his wife. So you've got this paper trail chronicling this guy's illness. And he suffered through some incredibly difficult malady. I mean, if you read the whole account, it must have been a miserable ending to his life. But Kirby is getting the best possible medical care. And he is suffering the same illnesses that some of the private soldiers have. So it makes you sort of wonder, what was their experience like? They wouldn't have received as much care and attention, and they would have been left to suffer. So this kind of reinforces the point that Fort Stoddert was indeed a frontier outpost, may have been surrounded by some early settlements, but it was still a long way from the best supplied places in the United States, and it was not necessarily a post that you probably want to end up being assigned to. We've got an account of a very young Sarah Hainsworth Gale, who eventually would go on to marry future governor of Alabama. As she's a child, she remembered being at the fort. Her parents had moved there in the general area, and she remembered how impressive it was to see soldiers that were performing military maneuvers and dressing in military uniforms and all that, how they made a big impression on her. She wrote about that in her diary. And the most interesting thing to me is that she distinctly remembered one of the biggest games they had was that as a little girl, 4 or 5, the guys from the soldiers from the camp would put her on the wheel of the cannon and take bets if they could fire the cannon without her flinching. And she eventually got where she couldn't flinch. So there's a lot of spare time at Fort Stoddert. That's why I take it. Fort Stoddert is this frontier outpost right there on the border, got all these circumstances going on. And you remember, and this quote comes from a friend, John Sledge. He said, "You could not help the commander of the fort from thinking he was basically holding down the lid of a powder keg, because in every direction you've got potential problems. You've got Native Americans, some who don't mind you being there, some who don't want you there. One day, some of the guys at the fort decided it would be great fun to fire a cannon over the heads of some passing Creek Indians on the Mobile River, and almost sparked a little war there. So you've got that. You've got runaway slaves. Mobile is a big town for the time. It's owned by the Spanish, but any slave who's attempting for freedom, they're going to run across that border to where there's less jurisdiction. And so you've got people who are coming looking for these guys. And the post commander at Fort Stoddert is in this position of, am I enforcing American law, Spanish law? So he's in a difficult spot. And then you've got Spain, of course, down there at Mobile, which is watching you carefully. And Spain is actually charging even the American officials to supply the post. They are charging them 10 and 12% tariffs on duties coming in or out of the Mobile River because they control Mobile. So you've got all this going on. And Fort Stoddert, although it's this out-of-the-way place, kind of small, ends up being incredibly significant in international diplomacy. And you've got guys like Harry Truman who are stationed there. Truman took over Kirby's spot. And you've got a succession of important people with very important jobs who get to the area before there's an established network of facilities to place them in. So they all end up serving at Fort Stoddert. You've got almost all the records of a certain period of time in early Mississippi territory in this section of the territory are dated Fort Stoddert. So Fort Stoddert becomes sort of the nerve center to Washington, D.C. and the rest of the world about what's going on in the Mississippi territory. Truman is an example of that. He held 4 or 5 positions at once. He would be a circuit judge, and he would literally get on his horse and ride from community to community and try to hold court and enforce the law by himself. In some cases, he was the judge and the sheriff. And if he issued an order for somebody who was going to be in prison, sometimes there was nobody to round him up and put him in prison but him. So this guy became an extension of American law in a lot of ways, and his office was at Fort Stoddert for a while. One of the most important things that the officers at Fort Stoddert did was to sort out land claims. This is just a drawing that goes along with a land deed from the time that was processed at Fort Stoddert. And you've got to remember that some of these land claims would literally have been issued by France and then reissued by Spain and Great Britain and America, and they've got conflicting boundaries, conflicting languages, and you put all that together, and they had a lot of work to do. And they tried their best to do it in some not great circumstances at Fort Stoddert. But it's where you begin to see the area take shape. And just a little interesting footnote, I show this for people I do it locally, is that just to illustrate how confusing some of the land claims were, Fort Stoddert has never moved, but it's been in 3 counties. When Washington County was first founded, it was in that county, and then it was in Baldwin County before they changed the borders, and Baldwin County's borders were shifted to what you see today, and that's when it became part of Mobile County. So just a little interesting side note about its location, just to help illustrate how confusing some of this stuff may be. But I mentioned that Fort Stoddert was an area that was growing. People were moving to settle there. A lot of people recognized it had some advantages. And it was on the rivers. And some people very, very early on recognized that the area was growing. It had a lot of reasons that it could successfully lure settlers for agriculture, trade on the river, et cetera. And they began to wonder, why are we under a government with our capital of the territory over at Natchez? Why don't we have our own state over here? And there was a very early on a movement that sort of centered around Fort Stoddert to establish a new American territory, to sort of break away from the Mississippi Territory and call it the Territory of Mobile very early. It didn't really gain traction. Ultimately, the Mississippi Territory is divided between Alabama and Mississippi, so what those guys were asking for that early ultimately happened in some ways, but the effort to create a separate state out of the eastern section of the territory had been going on for a long time before Alabama was established. One of the more significant things that people may be familiar with that happened at Fort Stoddert was that the Alabama's first newspaper was published there, the Mobile Sentinel. It was called Mobile because the guys who established the paper there came expecting any moment for Spain to give up claim to Mobile, and they would walk in there and establish a new newspaper in this growing American city. But they got there as far as Fort Stoddert, and they realized the Spanish are still there, so they just set up shop at Fort Stoddert, and they issued the first newspaper in Alabama. From there, half of its articles are all about the transfer of Mobile. When's it going to happen? That was the big question. The federal road, I mentioned that Fort Stoddert is important because it's location on the river. It's also the terminus of the federal road. Ended right there at the gates of Fort Stoddert originally, and you probably heard of the federal road cutting through from Georgia, ultimately connecting to D.C. and ultimately on to New Orleans, but it ran through Alabama, and its original terminus was officially at Fort Stoddert. And so troops that went out to construct this road came from Fort Stoddert on the southern end of it. And actually on that road, it cut through Creek territory, so passports would be issued to travel through Creek territory from Fort Stoddert. So again, it's serving a variety of functions. And the mail is supposed to be delivered and connect between the Chattahoochee and Fort Stoddert. So Fort Stoddert figures in every function of early Alabama's history. And it's got this specific schedule they tried to put in place in about 1807 or so. You just take a wild guess how often that schedule was adhered to. It didn't happen that often, but they tried to. And Fort Stoddert's such an important spot. I like to show this quote, just if you're not familiar with it, that's deserving of its own presentation, but there's a great book about the Federal Road, and this last sentence is what strikes me. Says, the chances are good. If you trace ancestry to anywhere in Alabama south of the Tennessee Valley, you probably got a good chance that your forebears came over the Federal Road. So that kind of sums up its importance. And to think that its end point, or beginning point, if you look at it from the direction, was Fort Stoddert, makes it pretty significant. The most famous thing that happened at Fort Stoddert probably is that Aaron Burr was held there after he was captured. And I won't go into the whole backstory, but you know, he got involved with the duel with Hamilton, fell out of favor in his native New York, and eventually decided that he would do something along the lines of establishing some new territory or encouraging Western states to break away from the United States. He was doing something to establish a new government he was going to run west of the Mississippi. History still doesn't know exactly what he planned, but when he came down the Mississippi River, people heard about it, they got alert to it. There was a judge that held him in Natchez and had him tried by a grand jury. The grand jury said, there's no evidence to convict him, he's free to go, but the judge said, there's something fishy here. We're not going to charge him, but I'm ordering that he stays here for a few weeks. And so Burr said, well, you know, you got nothing on me, I'm leaving. And he kind of disappeared. And he reappeared near Fort Stoddert, where they caught him visiting a guy's house. And this is a map of Washington County. I know you can't read it, but there's a note, Burr captured here. That they captured him on the road not far from Fort Stoddert, where they were going to bring him to hear the charges against him. Ultimately, he's tried in Richmond, Virginia. But the commander of Fort Stoddert takes him, captures him, takes him to Fort Stoddert. That's where he's held for a few weeks. And when they release him, he makes his way across the Delta, goes to Mims Ferry, lands right here. This is the landing spot of the ferry near the site of Fort Mims today, and there's a little spring that's still there. I didn't know this till I got involved in the book, but there's a little spring called the Burr Spring, because allegedly when he stepped ashore there, he stopped at a little spring to fill up his canteen. And it's still there, and they call it Burr Spring. I didn't know that until I started research there. The ongoing controversy about that West Florida, that Fort Stoddert gets involved in, is about ownership of this area that's owned by Spain that I keep referring to. Everybody's familiar with the Louisiana Purchase, where the United States gained this huge swath of the continent, stretching from New Orleans up to the Midwest. And there's a provision in that treaty that says the area that's being ceded has the same boundaries as the colony of Louisiana when the French owned it. Now, the controversy is that when the French owned it, going all the way back to the early 1700s, this was not the boundary. The original boundary between the French settlement and the Spanish was right here, the Perdido River, separating Baldwin County and Florida today. That's what the original boundary was. So the United States seized on that little vague passage and said, by the terms of the Louisiana Treaty, we should own the Gulf Coast as well. And so they started pressing that claim, and there's a whole long story to that. Spain, of course, disagreed. But the upshot of it for what we're talking about today is that eventually there is an effort, a real rebellion, to capture the place from the Spanish. If they're not going to surrender it, Americans decide we're going to go down there and capture it from them. And so they do that at Baton Rouge. They actually capture the fort and declare themselves to be an independent republic, and declare the independent republic of West Florida. This is their flag, the first version of what we'd call a Bonnie Blue flag. And so they established that they're going to have an independent republic and exist about 30 days, just long enough for the mail to go to D.C. for them to get news of what had happened. They'd immediately annex West Florida into Louisiana. And while all that was going on, there's an effort to do the same thing. Not advancing. You may need to advance it for me. Yeah. So, crisis seems to be fast approaching. There's an effort to do the exact same thing at Mobile. And a lot of people don't realize that, but there's a group that came over from Baton Rouge, came over to near Fort Stoddert, and they were planning on attacking Mobile and just taking it from Spain the same way they did it at Baton Rouge. But ultimately, the American officials helped warn the Spanish what was going on, and the Spanish ended up going up and attacking this little group in a little skirmish in Mobile County. Actually attacked them and they killed some of them and sent some to jail in Cuba. So there was no rebellion, no successful rebellion in Mobile. But Fort Stoddart's role in that is the information center where troops are gathering and information is being assembled for the entire thing. Now, the last episode in the fort's history, where we'll close today, is what brought its days to an end. It's the Creek War. And I can obviously give you a lot on the Creek War. We don't have time to, but I'm sure you know a little bit about that. And once there was a concern that the Creeks may attack the United States, there's several fortifications that pop up here where settlers are fleeing to. One of them is Fort Mims. Here's Stoddert, just across the delta from it. And after Fort Mims is attacked, there's a little delay on this every once in a while. After Fort Mims is attacked, that's when the word goes out that there's a serious problem down the Southwest. That's where Andrew Jackson and his armies are raised to put down what they call a Creek Rebellion. But the very few survivors that fled this horrific massacre at Fort Mims, some of the first ones, make their way to Fort Stoddert. That is where the word goes out to the nation of what had happened at Fort Mims. That's where the Creek War, the word of that happens. And that's where the first troops that go up and see what had happened at Fort Mims go from. And that's where these accounts like J.P. Kennedy, who talked about seeing pregnant women killed and their bellies cut open and all this stuff that gets in papers across the nation, it came from troops from Fort Stoddert. And there's a lot of chaos. A lot of people were some were leaving from the Fort Stoddert area seeking safety, and then some were coming to Fort Stoddert. So there's a great movement of people, and Fort Stoddert remains a very important spot for troops who were sent to the area to fight the Creek War. It's where Claiborne's entire army is sent to Fort Stoddert, and disperse to go into these campaigns. And some of the guys who escaped Fort Mims made their way at night in a canoe to Fort Stoddert. So that's what that image is about. And of course, Andrew Jackson came through Fort Stoddert after all of this. He's coming after the Creek, basically won the Creek War, and he's coming down to defend Mobile against the British invasion, which ultimately is going to be fought at New Orleans, and he actually stops at Fort Stoddert. And by then, Mobile had been delivered into the American hands. There's a battle or two of the Creek War down at Fort Boyer, and ultimately Jackson is going to defeat the British at Chalmette, New Orleans. And a few years after that, of course, Alabama is going to enter the Union as a state, Mississippi as a state. But shortly after this, 1814, shortly after the Creek War is over, and Spain had relinquished territory where Mobile sits, Fort Stoddert's no longer on the international boundary. Its primary strategic significance has changed. And there's a new fortification that's built on the opposite side of the Delta to do some of the things it did, but it was more on a main communication route, a land route. And there's never an order that I've ever found that officially says Fort Stoddert is abandoned. It just sort of happens. Over a period of months, they transfer the equipment, they transfer stores, troops are dispersed, and Fort Stoddert is left. It's just left in the woods there. And it remains a place that's known a long time. Now, years later, there will be an arsenal placed at Mount Vernon, which is 3 miles away on a big bluff where troops from Fort Stoddert had camped on occasion. But that's 1820s, 1830s. This is after the fort's period of significance. So sometimes people get confused about that. But the fort site itself just basically remained a cotton landing because the old landing they used remained in place for a long time. And there was actually a steamboat accident or two on the Mobile River, and they referenced that it happened so-and-so miles away from the old Fort Stoddert landing. So it remained a county landmark for a long time, but just sort of faded away. And its site is on private land overlooking the banks of the Mobile River. It's just off to the left out of the shot right there. And there's just a lot more that could be discovered about it. And I hope that what I've done today is introduce you to a very important landmark in Alabama history. And maybe one day we'll get some actual archaeology there that could study it, define its boundaries, and maybe cause a whole another book to be written. But for now, this is the only book on Fort Stoddert, and it's been a pleasure to do it, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about it. I did bring a few books and several other things I've written. If you're interested, I'd love to show you those after we get through the presentation. So I know we got just a minute or two for questions. Any questions? I know I just went through a lot of things in a whirlwind. What can I straighten out for you? I hesitate to say because I may be way off, but it may be something like 160 by 160. It's not huge. It's not a big area. Most of the troops that were there were housed in a single barracks building, and they usually had 60 to 70 people. And by the artifacts that have been found through amateur archaeology, it would definitely appear that most of the activities like the cooking and things like that were happening outside the fort. Place was not under immediate attack at any point until they got concerned about it in the Creek War. More than likely, a good number of the troops were just living in little lean-tos and things outside the fort. So I don't think it was a big place. Where Toulmin and Kirby and all, where they set their land office, there's correspondence talking about how they had to make use of one of the barracks because buildings were so limited. So you got this one structure in there where most of the people were living, and they took over it and kind of kicked some of the soldiers out. So there's nothing that indicates that they enlarged it, grew it, or anything. I think it was a fairly small fortification designed for a few dozen guys, and most of them were living outside the fort a great deal of the time. That's my understanding of it. Any other questions? Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to thank Dr. Bunn because, this is one of those subjects I had no knowledge of prior to this, but now that I've heard it, if the book reads anything like his presentation, I can't wait to read it because it's just so nice to see somebody that knows their subject so well, they can stand here and talk about it so comfortably. So thank you, Dr. Bunn, for all that you've done with your writing and your research and sharing that with us. And I also want to thank Mr. Chris. You were a great cookie girl today. Thank you to First Bank of Alabama. You did Coosa Valley Medical Center's cookies a great justice today. Thank you to everybody for being here. Next week we have a treat. Chris Carden is a Sylacauga native, and most of y'all know Chris. He used to be our police chief. He breezes in and out of Sylacauga every once in a while, but we're going to capture him next week for a little while, and he's going to do a program on the history of the Sylacauga Police Department. I've been told over and over it is fantastic and you need to see it, so we hope that you'll all come out and support Chris coming back home with us for a little while. Thank you all again so much. We will see you next week. Don't forget, stop back by and grab a book from Dr. Bunn and just say hello. Thank you. Quick. Hey, and don't forget, we have plenty of cookies left. Everybody grab an extra bag on your way out.